Well, hello and welcome back to another episode of Breaking the Blocks. I'm Rachel Pearman, your host. And if you're watching us on YouTube, I would love it if you would please give me a ding, thumbs up, if you would subscribe to the channel and perhaps leave a comment below. Do you know why? Because this tells the algorithm that you're interested in the content. And that means the algorithm pushes us out to other people. And if you're getting something out of these interviews, you never know, someone else might find inspiration in them as well. So we're all helping each other. So if you would do that, I would really appreciate it. But thank you so much for being here. Well, hello, lovely listener. Welcome back to another episode of Breaking the Blocks. I'm your host, Rachel Pearman. In this episode, I'm interviewing artist Timothy Foss. I saw him on Instagram working with a single piece of graphite, and the way that he moved the graphite and created these incredible shapes, I just found it absolutely mystifying. And so I reached out to him and asked him if he'd do a class with us on Crafty Monkeys. He said yes, and then I said, what about the podcast Breaking the Blocks? Do you have anything that you think you've overcome and you've used creativity to get through it? And he said, oh, absolutely. One thing I really suffer with is ADHD. And I just find that the movement of the art that I create, the way that I work with the materials, really helps me into a kind of calm, meditative space. So I interviewed him on that subject. But this interview meandered very much, as Tim would say, like his mind does on a daily basis. And we ended up talking about a whole variety of subjects. So I do hope that you will enjoy this interview, sit back and relax, and maybe take something from it yourself. I just realised, is it Tim or Timothy? I forget, because we had a conversation about what I call you. Tim or Timothy?
You can call me Tim. I go by Timothy just to sound pretentious sometimes, I think was the... Yeah.
Okay.
So when I write it down, I say Timothy, but it's a lot of syllables.
It's a lot. Timothy. Do you know, I said to you, there was a sitcom in England, which some people now who are listening, they know what I'm going to say, because there was this amazing comedian in it called Roddy Corbett, who actually, strangely, I looked like when I was a child.
Yeah.
And he did visit the town where my mother lived. So I'm wondering if there was a bit of a dalliance. Anyway, he used to have this mother who was always shouting at him. And he was still in his 50s, 60s, and he lived at home with her. And she would call him Timothy. Timothy. So whenever I say Timothy, I always think it's very official. Timothy.
And there's Monty Python's skit too. I am Tim.
Tim.
I am Tim. What shall we call you, great one? I am Tim. I'm quoting it badly. And there's so many Timmies. Like there's a lot of Timmies in cartoons. They usually fell down wells for some reason. It's very jumbled. But yeah.
Like the beginning of this interview, really, it's very jumbled. Yeah. I sense this is how the whole thing is going to go on.
This might be like this, yeah. This is there's going to be some conversation about ADHD, right? So
exactly.
Welcome to my reality of it's all related.
Yeah.
But
we've just jumped straight in there, haven't we?
We have, yeah.
Well, I love your world. I've only met you once, and we had a very long, conversation. I literally got in touch with you because I love your artwork.
Thank you.
I love I was going to say a very technical term then, Tim, which is swooshiness. Oh. I know.
Yeah.
I just love the way that you play and you move, and it's all this fantastic motion that creates these pictures that have this depth and this light and this shadow from very simple, maybe one color, or we'll talk about this later on in the interview, but I just love what you do. So obviously I approached you on Instagram and said, hey, would you like to come and teach a class? And this is the first thing we're going to do is the podcast, but hopefully a class is coming from you.
Yeah, we'll talk.
We will talk. We'll get the agents to put it in a diaries. Our imaginary agents in our heads.
I love that you say diaries. That's a very
diary.
Yeah.
What do you
for us,
say?
it would just be our calendar. Yeah, put it in our calendars. Yeah.
I'm going to write an entry in my diary.
Yeah, it sounds much more, I don't know, some kind of fancy old school way of contributing to the world. It's like, I'm writing this story in my diary.
It's very true. It's very true. Let's talk about you and your art, because one thing I find amazing about the people that I talk to in this podcast is that so many people have not always been full-time artists or sewers or quilters. And in fact, not just that, Tim, a lot of people have actually not done their art or practiced sewing until they're like in their 40s. There have been many people, and I think this is a really great thing for us to put across, because the whole point of this podcast, one, is to talk about how we get over blocks in our life, but also to try and encourage creativity in others, which is something that you really want to do as well with your account.
It is. Yeah.
So let's talk about you and your previous life to this moment when I'm talking to you. So have you always been artistically minded and creative?
It's kind of an inevitability for me. I think the initial impulse was to capture something that felt like sort of deeply connected to the world, and particularly to nature. I think I loved Ranger Rick magazines, which was a Wildlife Federation magazine for kids, and would draw illustrations of all the animals in there. I especially loved bald eagles, and I remember a deer with these glowing antlers that I tried to get perfect, and it was always pencil. And I felt very interested in trying to somehow express how incredible I felt about the world. And it felt like a duty in a way. And I always felt like you could never get it. And so there's this impulse to somehow capture a relationship to, especially the natural world, and my love of it, that I could never satisfy. So there's a pang there, I think, that drives me to be creative.
You said you always had drawn these amazing creatures from nature. So was that when you were very little? When did you actually start?
Yeah, very little. I mean, I can remember starting this probably before I could, write. It was always interesting to me. And most people do start drawing before they write, which I think is something we forget, that we're most likely to be capturing just kind of shapes and movements, of our arms on a piece of paper before we're ever going to start creating letters. And so I don't know if you could ever track the origin, the first time. And my drawings were really focused on trying to get things real. I think there was a romance to what it could be to create an illusion of something on the page that, wasn't real but imagined. And I think it's best captured by a pretty conceptual video artist named Bill Viola, who said, "There's an invisible world and we're living in it." This feeling that somehow everywhere there's something more going on than we can really see, or the things we imagine could be more real than we give them credit for, that the supernatural is really just the natural world, but we haven't figured out how to explain it yet. So I particularly loved realism at the time, and for a lot of my years, because it seemed to put onto paper something that appeared real but was still imagined. And that satisfied tried to satisfy a lot of my excitement about the world and the beauty. And of course, the excitement about art itself, that this thing existed, that you could try to make things that captured the world.
Yeah. So did you continue that then through your, as you grew up into your adult life?
I always did. Yeah. I think the other thing that I would do was music. That was really important to me. So I played piano from about 5 years old, and that went right up into my college years. So probably about like 13, 14 years of lessons. And within that time, I mostly was learning to read music, but I also learned to perform and sing, and I was dancing in musical theater. So those things were also part of it for me. And at a point of going to college, there was a crossroads where I kind of even had to choose between music and visual art. But I had a very influential ceramics and art teacher in high school who really pushed me to pursue ceramics. And that was another layer that I kind of found, it's different because with ceramics, you're not really trying to create an illusion of something. You're actually making something that you can hold in your hands. And at that point, it's an expression kind of your body and the way that an object then relates to your body. And when you give away a cup, it's like probably the only art form where you're really like giving something to someone that they're going to like hold their lips to. It's such an intimate thing. And what the edge of like, this is just a canning jar, but what the edge of something feels like on your lips is really sweet and intimate. So that stuff was another way of expressing some of that same love of trying to connect to people through artwork. It also tied me kind of to like my working class roots. My grandfather on one side was a machinist, and he had all sorts of things he would create, little like fishing lures, and he would fix clocks. And my dad and I worked in the wood shop a lot together as a kid. So I was very interested in real things too, making and constructing things.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you actually, if your family were creative, because, as you said there, you did all sorts of things. So that is interesting, but definitely you were around it from a young age.
Yeah, my father as a woodworker, carpenter, tinkerer, handyman, he was a big influence on my desire to use my hands to fix things, to be resourceful. And my mother was a musician, so she didn't do that as a living, but she taught me to sing harmony. This was kind of growing up in the church, which I've sort of abandoned in terms of like my religious outlook, but it's definitely still the origins of my music. And so listening to records with her, musical theater, but also Tchaikovsky and then a cracker and all these like really romantic things were very important to me. She wasn't very particularly drawn to pop music or the stuff of the times. And so growing up in the 60s, she surprisingly missed out on all the big like names like Dylan or whatever. And I had to discover all of that later. So I've taught her a lot about the era she kind of grew up in. But she taught me about like sort of the depths of musical training and how to have an ear for harmonies. So those were both very important things, but it is interesting that neither of them did them as a living. But I do think my mother's interest in music and then her love of theme parties and decorating, and she loved arranging flowers. She now even still studies ikebana, and even right now, that's Japanese flower arranging. Even now she's asking me to like contribute pottery to a show she's about to do. So these are old pots. But yeah, it was always around in that way. My brother was also very good at music. He didn't really pursue visual art as much, but became a graphic designer. He works for Apple now. And so there was a lot of creativity kind of around us.
That's fantastic.
It's
so nice to hear what seems like a very solid beginning and a close-knit family, or certainly a family who is still in a good place, because I can't tell you the number of people who I meet who have just got terrible relationships and never had good relationships, or they've been big fallouts. So it's fantastic to hear that you've got this lovely creative background and it still continues, and you're all still, winding it into each other's lives as well, which is lovely.
It's true. And, one of the things when you mentioned that this was kind of about overcoming blocks, breaking blocks, and was that as I was framing it, I think one of the big things that I could frame that question in is the question of privilege. Like, what are the privileges of a life, And that I think is kind of the block that I've worked through most recently, is understanding my privilege better. And one of the greatest privileges in my life is that stability, of a family that was close, and cooked homemade meals and gardened together. And I knew as an artist growing up into my adult life that if I failed, I could fall back on something. And I think that's a huge privilege, which is, I think, the only reason I could be an artist today on some level.
I think it's wonderful that you see that as a privilege.
I mean, I've always thought about myself as a social justice minded person. I was an activist in my 20s. But how do we actually like look at privilege knowing there's so much injustice and there's so many things we'd like to respond to and sort of remedy or somehow rise to and evolve out of culturally as a people, as a humanity? And I think the main thing that I'm learning is that privilege really isn't so much something to feel bad about so much as it is something that needs to be risen to. How do we rise to our privilege? How do we not sort of fail at becoming what we're meant to become with that privilege? How do we contribute? Because we have to wonder about that right now. this is a time where we're really being called to wonder about that.
I mean, you and I touched on this in our first chat that we had, that the pandemic, the whole 3-year period from when it, began and we were locked down and everything that followed, I think has been an incredible time for so many people. I have met so many people who have drastically changed their lives now at the end of this 3-year period. Although I still think it's going on, and I think there's an adjustment for people.
As it should, yeah. But I do think we all really do relate to this feeling of not having enough community. How are we all still kind of part of a humanity? And I am caring a lot about that through the lens of art as much as I can right now. So I kind of want to put out there that the word privilege is kind of a tricky word, and we can remember that. And really, maybe what we're trying to solve for isn't so much how to get everybody to be privileged, but how to get everybody to feel more relatable, that we're all relatives on some level.
Yeah, and connected, as you say, which is something that I think that the creative world does bring people together.
I think so.
Let's just go back to you studied, as you said. Did you then become a full-time artist or musician or ceramicist?
Yeah, I did. I kind of had a funny path, though, where I finished with an art major. I left behind like some kind of crazy belief that I was going to be in seminary and like going to go get a master's in divinity. So there was this weird part of me that thought I could be a scholar, but that clearly wasn't going to be my path ever. I didn't have the mind for holding details and facts and depths of, reference material in my head. So luckily I dodged that bullet, but I recognized that art could kind of follow me anywhere, wherever my beliefs would go. I knew I had this way of kind of expressing them, and maybe there's a career in that. Art school rarely, at least at that era, taught you much about how to have a career. You do just kind of get cut loose. It's almost like you're just at the top of a slide when you leave college. You're like the whole time you've just gone up this slide, you've learned how to climb all the rungs, and then they're like, bye. And you're just like, holy shit. Yeah. And the only thing that felt wonderful was that I suddenly didn't have to think in terms of semesters. I was like, oh, well, I don't have to, nothing's due in 3 months. So there was this liberation, and that slide doesn't just like end in despair. It kind of slides and goes up and down. And now we're just kind of on this journey, and that felt wonderful. The summers didn't mean you're done. You got to keep kind of trying things. And one day I opened up the weekly paper, and on the back page, there was like Potter Wanted. And I somehow from ad in the newspaper got a job as a potter at this place where I had to learn how to throw things for like 50 cents per piece. And in 6 months learned to make so many pots that I could get paid, for like 150 or 200 pots a day. I did want to give up pretty quickly at 6 months. I had carpal tunnel. I was like, there's not a career in this. But I did get a pottery studio because that was another kind of gift. I was at a cafe and there was a sign on the wall. So I tore off the phone number. I'm like, well, I might as well go do that. And I spent a summer doing that, and it was wonderful because the guy there kind of taught me how to make food for myself in a really like creative way, how to like live kind of on, very little income and just really engage in your life creatively. So that was really the first person who taught me that like life is kind of an art form too. It's not just that you have to think of it just in terms of what you produce. I got a call to go out west to Seattle. I was in Minnesota, and it was a friend of mine who went to college with me but happened to live back on the West Coast. And he said his aunt has a piece of land in the state of Washington that we could live on. And he happened to be a really good horticulturalist and a gardener, and said, why don't we grow food for ourselves? And finally got to Seattle, and I got a hold of him, and he says, I'm so sorry, but the land flooded. You want to move up north with me? And sure enough, I'm like in this weird little town north of Seattle, And the only job I could get was as a production potter. And the story kind of went on like that. I often, in some ways, have been running from being an artist for a living. Like I've been trying to get away from it, trying to do something more practical or do an art form that was more practical. Like there's often been this tension. I've never wanted to stop making art, but the question of it as a living was always hard to really fully reconcile.
It was amazing how all those things fell into place, just like the land being flooded. So that meant you had to go up north. And then guess what? There's a pottery job there.
There's this pottery job there.
It seems to me like things have kind of fallen in place for you. Not saying that you've had a perfect life, but why do you think it is that for some people, things fall into place and other people can never get a break? Is that just bad luck? Or is it, as you were saying, privilege? Or is it something to do with ourselves? Because you got a lot of breaks there.
I mean, come on, Rachel, that's not fair. Well, of course I have beliefs because I have that kind of brain. They are always beliefs. You know, beliefs are very confusing. I think we're made of beliefs more than anything else, you know, I think on some level. They're very difficult to change. They usually come from very deep places culturally. You know, they come from something you just didn't even know you inherited on some level. Brene Brown does some amazing writing about this in her book, Braving the Wilderness. And that book is about, sometimes you have a belief that's changing, but the people around you don't want you to change it. And so culturally, you end up in this wilderness. And she expresses that pretty well. And how do we stay in that wilderness if what we do need to do is play with beliefs? And I think what you're asking could be answered a lot of ways, but I think it still comes down to whether we humanize each other. If we live a life that's about trying to keep each other expressed or felt as equals and felt as like privileged to be here as anyone, no matter who you run into. It's a very difficult thing to practice. I mean, my own perspective on why things go right and things go wrong has a lot to do with times where things don't fall into place for me. And I have to really examine why. And there's a really wonderful question of like flow state, or when are we in the flow? When are we out of the flow? So while things have fallen into place, like you suggested, it's partly the narrative I've created that helps me look at it that way. I think that's a powerful question. How do you tell the story of your life if it's shrouded in all these shortcomings? Then, you know, it kind of creates a perception that your life is going to be full of more shortcomings. If your focus is how have you overcome those, how have you survived them, you know, then it might be how you continue to overcome them and survive them. Again, that stuff though, probably it's taught, you know, it's like we've received a lot of those teachings from important people in our lives. And I think one of the great privileges is if there is anyone that's given you that gift, it'll matter. It's probably going to make the biggest difference. So I think there's a degree to which we have to look at being out of flow as an opportunity. If we look at it with curiosity, I think that's the best thing we can do. There's this wonderful story, a great Buddhist thinker, Pema Chodron, you may have encountered. She told this story during like kind of the settling of America. There's all this tension and genocide of the Native American people. And one of the horrible things that would happen is sometimes Native Americans would be sort of exhibited, you know, as like sort of fair prizes. There is a story of a great Native American elder who this had happened to. He was taken from his tribe, his people, and brought to a most like kind of terrifying place, which for us is commonplace, and for him represented something quite terrifying and even evil. And that place was a train station, because a train essentially represented something that was coming to destroy you. And so he was brought to this place and had to stand there and wait for this train to come and get on it. And this was his initial kidnapping. And he went on to survive through all sorts of these like crazy kind of journeys he was on. And at a certain point, an anthropologist asked him, how do you face these fears? You know, all these things you've had to do. You've lost your family. You've had to get onto this like crazy machine that, you know, you've told me used to represent, you know, the death of your people. And he said, well, I've approached it always as being more curious than afraid. And I think that's the sort of main way we have to kind of look at what is the thing that's going to fall into place instead of nothing's ever going to fall into place. How do we see if like what's wrong right now is the opportunity for discovering that? And I think the more we decide to not look at it that way, and this is again just a belief, but I think that's when the universe will throw at you more and more and more shit, because it's trying to get you to see it. And at some point that gets to a point of being traumatic, I think. None of us maybe can prevent traumas, but there is a degree to which I think we can foresee ones we might be causing. The things we can prevent are few, but one of the things we can always do is look at the world as a place with curiosity and try to stay with it, I guess, as a crazy ride. And for me, a lot of that looks like trying to find things that are hilarious. I think comedians are an amazing resource for us. One of my favorite, just to call it out, is Mike Birbiglia. I think he's one of the most extraordinary American comedians of our time. And he has a beautiful podcast called Working It Out, where he interviews all these comedians, and they go really deep on subjects of life and philosophy and spirituality. And he often says, like, the best comedy is going to come from the most painful things in your life, you know, and we laugh to keep from crying. It might not be obvious, but my favorite thing to do in any gathering is help people laugh, because I think it's the way we connect the easiest. And luckily, for some reason, that was also kind of a gift of my family, is we always found a way to try to make everything funny. Even if they were terrible jokes, we were really committed to the bit. And it's a terrible topic to talk about abstractly, because it's not a very funny topic. But if you can make people laugh, and if you can laugh yourself, I think there's a lot of curiosity kind of in laughter. Rowan Atkinson showed up in my Instagram feed, since I'm talking to a Brit, and he was quoting Charlie Chaplin, saying, Charlie Chaplin used to say that life in close-up is where you see pain, but life in a long shot can be quite hilarious, you know. And from the point of view of film, that's practical, but from the point of view of perspective, that's true too. Trying to build practices in our lives where we can kind of see it as a movie is really useful. And that's a common teaching in Buddhist thinking or meditation practices, is try to remember you're sort of witnessing your life as much as you're living it. Don't always look at it like it's right here, that there's no way out, you know. If you can start to see like, oh, that's a hand, like, what does that do? Why is that here? You know, instead of just slapping your face all the time with it. God damn it.
I saw the same reel, by the way, with Rowan Atkinson.
Did you? Yeah, I think it must be trending.
It is, but I loved it, because I was going to use that because often I'll see little reels and then I'll just do a minute about it on my Breaking the Blocks thing, but what my thoughts are. Yeah, I mean, everything you've said there, you're so eloquent. Everything you just said, I have been through this for the last 3 or 4 years. First of all, when I started meditating, and I don't meditate that much, but I started meditating because I thought I need to do something, because I was getting lesson after lesson after lesson and wasn't getting it, and the lesson was getting bigger and bigger until it just all exploded. Yeah. And I thought, I have to start doing something. And I sat down one day and I'd read this thing that said, imagine you walk towards a bonfire. So I thought, okay, let's give this a go. Okay. So I just meditated. And as I walked towards this bonfire, I sat down, and then some Native American people just came and sat next to me. Now, I don't know why. I don't know where they
Wow.
came from, but
Mm-hmm.
they started saying all of these, oh, well, hello, you're finally
Mm.
here. You're
Mm.
finally stopping.
Mm.
And it was amazing. And then I had this one Native American person, this older man who would always appear in my meditations. And we used to walk
Mm.
through fields together. We would sit by rivers
Beautiful.
together. And he would give me these amazing lessons and things in these meditations. I just found it extraordinary.
So
So
moving.
that really resonated with me. And I would suggest to anybody to try and just
Yeah.
sit down and do that for 10 minutes and see what happens. I think we're in a time now, the age of Aquarius, where we are more open to these learnings, and we have to start
Mm.
taking all these things on board because our old ways are not working.
Right.
And I do think there's a split. I think that there is this split in the world, in the earth, and there are a group of people who are jumping on that train that's going somewhere, and then the people who want to stay in the old ways will stay in the old ways. There's a shift.
Yeah.
So I think it's fascinating.
We at least have to mention the book Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a beautiful story written by a Native American botanist. So she's just struggling, and she comes from both a Native American heritage and white heritage. And so this kind of fascinating person's ability to blend all these truths, both her own ancestry and then her training as a scientist, but then her perspective as a Native American, the relationship to plants. She's mentioning even like this one question, like why do these two flowers, like the purple flower and these yellow asters, why are they those colors and why are they so beautiful? That's never been answered in the botany world. It's not something scientists consider a valid question. And so it's amazing to look at it from the point of view of like trying to look at the world through an art's lens. Artists told her, well, there's purple and there's yellow, and they are kind of opposite on the color wheel. And like if you look at purple long enough and then look at a white wall, you'll see yellow. And if you look at yellow long enough and look at a white wall, you'll see a little halo of purple. And the way that like these laws of nature are operating matter, that we're going to often be stumbling across things that possibly do really have significance that we just think are kind of random. I think I mentioned earlier the supernatural, right? This idea that maybe these why do bad things happen to good people, those questions, they're not necessarily very answerable, but they may be as natural as anything. They may just be unexplainable at this point. And so our greatest curiosities are crucial. And I think there's wisdom we've lost. And I think that's part of what your vision can be about. And I think that's part of what books like this are trying to reconcile. She's very candid about how much she doesn't understand and how much she's lost. So I don't know where all this is going. I think there's a creativity and a curiosity, though, from those more ancient perspectives. And I think it's beyond just Native Americans. It's just anyone that's trying to tap into what's going to most likely carry us into the future. She even says to become indigenous is to care about how your children will experience their lives. And I think in a way, this desire to kind of have an encounter with someone who's indigenous is a desire to find a way back to something that feels truthful and possible and in balance, or at least thinks of balance as the focus. And she's an amazing writer.
But let's circle it back to the art for you then, Tim, because when I first came across you, it was in one of your Instagram reels, and this is what made me really interested in you. Yes, I loved what you were doing with your swooshiness, technical term, but it's you were talking about being at one with a piece of art that you were creating, and how movement facilitated your art, and how we had to go within the flow. So you've been talking about, being in the flow with the universe, which I absolutely agree with you. It's like it's been able to be in flow with the energy around us and with the opportunities. And I totally agree when you said sometimes when you're out of flow, that's when you start paddling back up the river, and then it's not going to work. Let's talk about your art. So what does it do for you then? How does it help you to get into the flow?
Art is like both a practice for like learning about flow for your own life. And it's also, I think, flow itself. At times making art is a flow state. There's even science that it's like if you spend an hour and a half, you're more likely to enter a flow state than if you even spend, an hour or an hour and 15 minutes, all this data. But I think that's actually been useful trying to learn that, well, if I'm going to bother, let's see if I can pull off an hour and a half, just in terms of practical advice. Like it really has helped. I've been surprised how much an hour and a half matters compared to, 10 minutes or an hour. There's a far end of that too. You can go so far where really all you're doing is just feeling exhausted and frustrated. But I think the main thing that tips things into flow state has to do with your commitment, your desire to stay kind of in it. So I think, like I'm saying, it applies to the practice of making a piece of art, and it applies to life. Like, how do you stay kind of committed? Like, what is your practice to stay committed? If I were learning something from making art, it's how to stay with a process that often is unforgiving. Often you don't get the results you'd like. I mean, I guess that makes us wonder, like, what do we like? So I think one of the things that I really value about making visual art is that I have evidence that it happened, that it's not even evidence for anyone else but me, and that by getting into those flow states, something happens to my brain that allows me to feel like it's okay. Like I can keep at this. Like it's not easy, and it's going to be really difficult to even know what the point of it is, what the end result is. But it allows me to kind of access this part of me that feels like I've accomplished something, even if it's very difficult to describe or leverage.
The art that you're creating and everything that you've just said there it's very much helping you as a person, and to have the curiosity, as we're talking about, to understand yourself, to go with the flow. I've talked to a lot of artists who, when it becomes a business, they lose that flow.
I am doing it as a business. Art has kind of chased me, It seems like what happened in the pandemic for me was I thought I should get a real job. And I've probably done this every few years in some way. And even with a pretty successful freelance business making art at events, once the pandemic hit, those events ended. And so then I couldn't make that. And so I was like, well, I should probably get another kind of job that I could maybe do remotely. I was faced with a lot of childcare, so I couldn't just like start right away. So I had a lot of time to kind of ruminate on it. The world sort of exploded around George Floyd. As I said, there was this whole question of privilege. Like, do I decide that this is a privilege to make art? And maybe it's like arrogant of me to make art. And so all of that stuff came up. And what I really like ended up finding was the only option on some level is to do what I've learned to do at this point. And that's sort of the greatest gift of all at this point, is that it followed me long enough for me to have to kind of throw up my hands and be like, and say to my wife, like, I know we want me to have like a quote unquote real job, and it's going to have this kind of bottom line. But in terms of like my mental health, my ability to reinvent myself as a white middle class, middle-aged man in a time when the kind of like meaningful work I want to do, it's like I'm probably the worst resume somebody's going to get. I'm not really trying to pretend that I can just reinvent myself to anything. And in some strange ways, like, it's a lack of privilege that's helping me in that case. It's like I can't just become anyone I want just because I'm this like white man. It's like I can't become anything I want just because I have like a liberal arts degree and I'm a creative, curious person. What can I do? And the breakthrough kind of came from the point of view of learning more about the potential for art to have an effect on the world. And I read this book called Your Brain on Art, which I recommend. Turns out there's this whole field of study around neuroaesthetics and the effect of art on the brain. And I started to see it as an opportunity to say, like, to myself, for first of all, to my wife as a partner in a household, and kind of to the world, that like art matters because it helps us connect and it helps us be in a place where there's a degree of ambiguity. We look at a piece of art and we may not ever fully understand it. And that's very much how our society feels right now. Like you said, there's people maybe staying like in the old ways and trying to get on the train into the new ways. And it's like two stories. And there's this problem of getting off the old story and getting on the new one. And we don't even know what the new story is yet. And art in a lot of ways can be an ambiguity longer than most any other thing. And so I think it's helping a brain be comfortable with uncertainty and ambiguity, possibly the end of humanity. I mean, these are really hard things to reconcile. A message I think we all need to hear, that art really is about connectivity. And we are all capable of connecting, that we don't have to look and compare only like one artist is better than another isn't really the angle I'm taking, that art really is just about this problem. How do we get to a new story? That's something I think actually in some strange way builds a market for my work. It's like I'm mostly focused on trying to tell that story. The art may never be the best art in the world. It may never be something I even particularly sit down and say, like, thank God I made that one piece or these series because it saved everything. It's more just that if I make stories and keep connecting with people, then I'm trying to at least stay engaged with an audience. And that's a lot of what a marketplace wants, is that engagement and that commitment to what you're doing. If I was trying to just reinvent myself, even into a meaningful career, which I did, I tried to work in like climate change work for a year in a service called AmeriCorps. I couldn't really I couldn't become as committed to it as all those scientists and students just coming out of college studying environmental sciences could ever be. So I really had to say, like, that was arrogant to try and reinvent myself. So I actually have to do the thing that I've learned to do and am called to. Luckily, it's something I also care about and something that chased me down. You know, places that can help us, like this website platforms helped us, people like you reaching out to help kind of talk about these things, that you can have a meaningful life and that is something that's valuable both in a marketplace and in our hearts. Can I teach it? Teaching is also a way to monetize things. I'm really excited to teach. At this point in my life, it's like such a gift to feel like I can create some kind of mentorship for people. All of that is really what a living looks like at this point. And it doesn't have to become a block, but it requires a lot of really like clever finagling. And for me, there's privilege in the runway that my wife provides right now with her career, but at times I've been a runway for her career. So it's like there is a lot of give and take there too. How to get the pieces that you have to fit together is a thing we need to be curious about too.
I love your approach. 2 words: curiosity and giving. 3 words: flow. These are 3 great words that describe you, I think. If someone said, what's Tim like? I'd say in the flow, has a curious mind, and is coming from a giving angle. Fantastic. Just fantastic and very unusual. So I want to talk about your mind, Tim, because I know that when we're talking about, we're going to discuss here, and you said that you have ADHD. And I was talking to another quilter who also suffers in this way. So I'd be interested to see how it affects you, because here's the thing. I see ADHD as almost having an overactive mind. Now, the problem with an
Mm-hmm.
overactive mind or a distracted mind is that we can then start to overthink. And when we overthink and everything is from here, then we lose our connection to our soul, to our higher self, because it's all in the brain. We're thinking, thinking, thinking. And yet
Yeah.
you're the opposite. So you've got this ADHD, which for me is overthinking distraction, but yet you're absolutely in the flow and listening to your higher self and going from what your soul is asking you to go from. So where are we reconciling these two things?
Mm. Yeah, well, that's a lot of kind words in my direction. I think, the understanding mental health is like, a never-ending problem. And I guess what's wonderful is that there's more tools than ever before. We've got much more awareness of what things like an ADHD diagnosis could mean, or bipolar, or depression and anxiety, which, depression, anxiety, and ADHD can be easily mistaken for each other. We're often distractible or unmotivated from depression and anxiety. ADHD can also create hyperfocus, which isn't something people were aware of, and that's a little more likely to be what I'm more likely to do. I have trouble switching tasks, but I could talk to you like this for 7 hours without almost noticing. So sometimes the problem is that then that'll cause a disruption that I forgot about 4 other things I was supposed to do today. So you kind of, and I didn't get diagnosed till I was an adult. And so it actually was kind of fascinating to look back at my life and be like, oh yeah, that explains kind of like why there was a lot of sensitivity for me around being critiqued for things that just most people could kind of brush off. I kind of had like a thin skin. People often talk about you have to develop a thick skin, and I was like, I don't think I know how to do that. So those were kind of the biggest tricks. Luckily, I found a lot of help from both, my wife's a therapist, so I get to ask her a lot of great questions about just, what's kind of the theoretical perspective on this. But I've taught her a lot of things about ADHD that she didn't know, because I've had to really research it too. And so that's kind of a fun give and take always. There's a ton of resources out there, one of which behavior modification kind of process where you kind of just go step by step. These are the problems, this is how you fix them, and that helps like the ADHD mind. But really, in a lot of ways, the biggest takeaway was kind of like day one of a process that was supposed to go on and on. Ironically, this like was an app-based thing, and the app started to glitch. So it's like, of course, yeah, like day 3. Now I'm like in like a tech rabbit hole trying to figure out how to get the app to work. I was like, well, this is just a nightmare. And but I got my money's worth, because they recommended this book called The One Thing, and that's been a really useful way to look at a day and kind of a moment in life where like there's an era you're kind of trying to define how do you pick kind of one thing that's going to guide you or help you feel like you accomplished something today towards your greater goal, which might be a bigger one thing. So for now, for me, that might be trying to make this work as an artist become a living, and how to do that as comfortably as possible. So there's something every day I'm hoping contributes to that. Even this interview today kind of can be the one thing. So I look back at the day and there's like 4,000 other things I didn't do. And most likely we all get pretty fixated on that. And that can contribute to our depression and our anxiety. And it makes us feel a lot of doubt that, oh, I have ADHD, I never get anything done. But that's been really useful because it's progress. And most likely, if we focus on something important enough, there's about 10 things on that list you probably didn't actually have to do anyway, or kind of resolve themselves, or represent small failures that are pretty tolerable to the people that you might be responsible to. So trying to look closely at that every day not being careless. I mean, I have to sometimes make the one thing just like, this is like all about kids today. Like, it's not going to be about my career, but I'm going to make that be the focus so that at least I'm doing that as well as I can. And if I'm challenged by, like, say, talking with my partner about, like, how, am I making progress about this or that? Like, what can we do to kind of encourage each other? If I'm challenged by her, it's like, mostly in my head, because she believes in me, and like I'm like, oh, I probably could have done more. It's kind of like, but I did this one thing, and I can say that, this is the thing, and that helps with a sense of confidence, helps with a sense of okayness. But here's the biggest trick I've found that I think applies to everybody. There's a Stanford researcher on the podcast 10% Happier. Yeah, Dan Harris is he wrote a book called 10% Happier. He was a news anchor, was like a war reporter, discovered meditation against his own better wishes. He thought it was all kind of an eye roll. But it's a great book because he's such a skeptic, and it helps a lot of people kind of discover the value of meditation. What this podcast interview was about with the Stanford researcher was New Year's resolutions. Why do we often give up on them? And he said it's because we don't have a deep relationship to our future self. We don't have an emotional connection to who we're going to become. We can kind of abstractly be like, yeah, I'm going to be older, or something. Maybe I'll be in a better house, or, we kind of have these, we kind of blow it off. So say you're going to try to like make more art this year and have that matter. What does that look like for you? Well, one thing he suggested is write to your future self 5 years from now, and then write back from your future self. And before all of that, write to your past self. And he said that could be often pretty emotional. Things you've failed at, or things you sort of had promised and you're just like, sorry, it kind of blew that. And it's like this thing of really just trying to say that's a person. It's like real. And my favorite trick, though those were lovely, was this idea of putting all yourselves like on a bus, and you're sort of the driver. And I was recently starting to do this just like while I'm brushing my teeth for 2 minutes. I have an electric toothbrush that times me. So I'm like, I got 2 minutes. And now I'm like really looking forward to brushing my teeth, which, who looks forward to that? But I sit down like on the edge of the bed, I'm brushing my teeth, maybe petting the cat. And then I just sit there and like meet with my future self a little bit. And it's like, I'm on this bus, and I can sort of like tell that the bus is a certain temperature today. It's like, maybe it's rowdy. Maybe everybody's kind of like grumpy. Maybe there's like somebody sort of bullying somebody else. And there's all these selves. And I think what's kind of interesting is like, you're still always the driver. And it helps you sort of ground yourself with the fact that, like, no matter how the bus feels, maybe it's actually people are really peacefully just looking out the window, and it's that part in a road trip where nobody's talking, but the radio's playing. There's a really cool, like, quick moment where you feel where you're at. And then it's like a chance to just be like, am I on the bus? Am I the driver? If you're the driver, you're more likely just kind of looking back and seeing like kind of what's going on. And you can switch. You can kind of consciously say, like, let me just be the driver for a second. What would I say? And recently I was in a lot of discomfort because something was like really bothering me in a relationship that I was having with a friend. And I was this person on the bus, just like kind of cowering and just like grumpy and sort of pissed and looking out the window, just like, and then all these people were kind of like rowdy around me, and I was just like, shut up, and then the bus driver was an option for me. So I was like, okay, what would the bus driver say? And I got up and like I turned around and I saw everybody. I said, let's sing a song. And then we started singing, wheels on the bus go round and round. I'm just like, what the fuck is going on? I'm just like brushing my teeth right now, like, why is this happening? And so like, and then he's like, let's just sing this song. And then we ran out of lyrics, and we all sort of stopped for a second, and we didn't know what to do. And it was kind of cool because none of this is real, right? It's all imagined. And then everybody just like turned to that one guy who's just like sitting there grumpy, and they just like gave him this really big hug. And I just started like bawling, like it was like the sweetest like gesture. And like the whole time, it's all just like me sitting there making it up. But it's fascinating how these selves become this kind of community the more I've sat there with them and gotten on this bus for like 2 minutes in the morning and 2 minutes at night. And it's because I'm developing a relationship with the like multitudes that I think exist for all of us, but especially for the ADHD mind, and that there's still always a driver, and that is a particular condition in the ADHD mind. It's like you have thoughts going every direction, but it's very difficult. If it's an intersection, there's no traffic cop. And most brains have a traffic cop. They're like, you guys go, and then you guys stop. And so the ADHD, everybody's just going, and it's just like, beep, beep, So the bus metaphor has really been great for me, and a chance to just kind of like be in your brain, let it really be where it is, and then develop this relationship to the future too. Because sometimes I'm like saying, who is this person in 5 years, and do I care about them? And so in some weird ways, I'm mixing metaphors because I think that's the bus driver, who knows? But I guess to have some kind of practice like that, where you sort of see your mind as a place that you can kind of get a little insight on and not overthink it, but recognize that it's never going to be something you can fully have control over. I mean, this also comes on the tail of like 15 years of meditating and a lot of yoga. I do Qigong, but you can do all that and not have these like playful experiences that really help you connect, and to always be looking for those. And it's always being updated. Like I think for me, especially my practice, because I'm ADHD, isn't usually as consistent as a lot of people. Some people are just like, I do this every day and it works, and I really admire that. But those same people were like, I'll never pick up a paintbrush, because I'll never learn to make art, and so we each have our barriers. You just got to figure out your way through.
I love that. I'm going to try that bus thing now. Oh,
Bus is a blast.
Can I just say though, I was fascinated that you were on the edge of your bed, brushing your teeth, patting the cat, and having a visualization. I mean, that's talent right there.
Well, it's like, I mean, it is sort of the beauty of the ADHD mind. The science of the ADHD mind is that it's a part of your brain that usually only turns on when you stop and kind of take a rest and you're kind of between tasks. And you just sort of sit down and you can kind of daydream and look out the window. And it's often then that we get our most creative ideas, or like when you're in the shower or when you're driving and you're kind of doing something, but you're kind of not doing anything. And that's a part of our brain that is always on when you're ADHD. And so you're usually connecting everything together. And it's because that part of your brain is kind of like always firing. And so it is really possible to kind of like be in a flow state and have all these things kind of connecting at the same time. But for me, like a focus on something allows it to be a little bit easier to kind of manage how loud everything kind of can be.
The interesting thing is, though, when you were on the bus and you were thinking about this friend that you're having this problem with, that you didn't have the friend get on the bus. I was writing a piece on the blog yesterday. I've not put it out yet, but I was writing it, and it was about happiness because I had seen a great reel on Instagram with Tim Minchin. He was giving a speech to a university, and he said, seeking happiness is like an orgasm. Think about it too much and it goes away. And I just thought that was so good. So seriously good. So, and I said this to my daughter and her friend at the beach on Saturday, and they both laughed. Because Brandon said, that's so funny. And I went, I can't take credit for that. It was actually Tim Minchin. Yeah. But he did say that is brilliant, because we were talking about why we were happy in that moment. I said to them, what's making you happy right now? And what are you happy for in your life? And they talked about being able to see the sea and be in this moment. I said I was thankful for all the people in my life who had been horrible to me because they had taught me so many great lessons. I was thankful for every experience in my life. If you try to make yourself happy, if you try to seek it, then you're just overthinking. It doesn't happen. But the key to happiness is to find it within yourself. Because if we're always seeking for happiness in others, I need people's validation, I need people's attention, I need this to make me happy, or I need that latest handbag or that car. You're always going to want the next thing. You're going to want the next person because you're going to wear that person out. So you're going to go for the next person and the next person, or the next handbag or the next car. And you're never going to be happy. So you have to be happy within yourself. So I think your boss is fantastic because there are no other people on there to give you a hug, to make you happy, only yourself. So that's really interesting.
Well, it reminds me of, I just got asked to kind of contribute to a blog, and one of the questions was, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Dream big. And my first reaction was exactly what they're sort of poking at, is like, how successful am I going to be? Or what's the big dream? And where is it going to finally be? And when I thought of this practice, it was like, in 5 years, what I can really say is that I think I'm going to be okay. And that was really like the thing. That was like, I just think I'm going to be okay because I'm developing this, like, I care about that person now. And that person's mostly telling me it's okay. And it's not telling me where my art's going to hang or how many Instagram followers I have or who I'm going to have some kind of horrible fight with, or it's just telling me that, like, I'm okay. And that's just been so moving to me to get to that point, and it's taken 50 years to maybe get to it. But I
love that.
It's part of what I've started to have to reshape my viewpoint on, and it's probably going to include amount of success to be okay. But I think it's important to remember that that is kind of like the idea.
I love that. It's really interesting because when you said that, I thought my answer would be 3 words. I'd be alive.
To be alive.
3 words. I'd be alive. Tell me, what is your accomplishment that you're most proud of at this point?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. I think I'm most proud of surviving parenting to this point, honestly. And that can be just kind of tongue-in-cheek sounding, but the beauty of it is that it's like an experience where you kind of decenter from your sort of the center of everything, and then you have to kind of deprioritize yourself. And then as my kids are now 10 and 15, it's kind of like I'm coming back online too. And so it's kind of like, to get to that point is a really extraordinary feeling, because there's definitely points where, like, well, I mean, it completely changed my perspective on having an art career because I had endless free time. So the solution a lot to an art career is to always kind of be working. And then it became like, I can't always be working. So then I have to choose what I really am going to do if I'm going to make art. And then I also have to choose something that's really going to make money. And that was a really stressful time. And it's led to the pandemic where all the things that I'd done to make money kind of collapsed. And so trying to come out of that, both like with kids that were healthy enough after going down like YouTube, rabbit holes, and a lot of social anxiety coming back out. My daughter stopped going to school even once school started again because she was surrounded by too much chaos. There was too many kids struggling, and the public school she was at just didn't really have a way to solve it. So we had to just kind of like float for 3 months. And that was all in the midst of me just like, I recovered from surgery that was maybe like cancer, and like all this like kind of heavy stuff was like, I was just spinning around all these fears. So to come around and be like, I think the most important thing is to not take myself out of the picture, but to put myself back in it and still try to show up for people, but recognize that that's I'm limited to how much that's going to be, that I can develop a relationship with the things I'm going to fail at. The people on the bus that I hate, I think I have to learn to accept and love. Like the person that does hate me at times is another part of me that, yeah, like that's the person everybody had to hug that day, you know, like it came down to just like being able to say that every aspect of yourself is only going to get like more difficult to manage if you don't love it, if you don't kind of like try to like find how it fits onto the bus. And the more it has a chance to kind of be felt and seen, and these can be really ugly parts of yourself, like the least likable parts of yourself. We may not be loving ourselves. We may be loving a version of ourselves we haven't become yet, or wish we were, or are sort of based on somebody else. Our imaginations are very unlimited. And it's very easy to get sort of pulled into believing you are this thing you're imagining. That was a long answer.
It was a great answer. Tim, it has been, I mean, we could go on for another 3 hours, but I think people may have switched off.
Could.
So I am going to wrap it up. But do you have a particular motto? Is there a phrase?
I mean, I have so many, and I said that one. That,
I knew you would.
A Bill Viola line about the world is invisible, basically. There's so much of the invisible world here. But the one that has actually been the most practical, that also ties to the most like creative part of myself, that also just relates to what I just said, is I had a choreographer in college, because of course I had to study dance too, because I apparently had to study every art form I possibly could, which felt really indulgent in college, but I'm so glad I did. But she said this beautiful thing where like, it's so simple, but limits are possibilities. That's it. And what she said is, if you're making a dance and you tie your arm to the side of your body, now that's a different dance. If you free your arm and take off all your clothes, now it's a different dance. And everything you're doing at some point is defined by its limits more than its possibilities. So in a weird way, the limits themselves are what make you possible and are what make things possible. And that applies both to the creative experience and both to your daily experience. I spent so much time thinking I didn't accomplish all these things today. So recognizing that that's kind of what makes you who you are is sort of, it's a weird way that like failure kind of is the success. Is like you're learning to see that all those things I didn't do defined me today. And if I can love that person, like that's really the work. Like that's being alive. Like you said, in 5 years, if I can keep doing that, then I'm living a life where I'm actually in it. You know, I'm not trying to get somewhere that I don't know if I'll ever get, and I'll be so mad if I never do.
That's probably the best motto I've heard, in terms of it's just 2 words and it's just fantastic. I absolutely love that. I love it.
Yeah.
Well, I've just loved this chat. It's just been amazing. It's been amazing. So I hope people have got with us right through to the end, because I don't intend to edit this. It's going to be one of the longest ones, but I don't care.
Oh my God.
I know.
I'm sorry, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm getting on the bus. And
I gotta go.
The wheels go round. So seriously, thank you. And I look forward to, keep watching your reels and your art and working with you in the future, of course. But yeah, it's been amazing. It's amazing when you just meet someone and you absolutely connect. There are so many similarities in our lives.
Yeah.
So many differences, but so many similarities.
There have been. Yeah.
And the same thinking patterns. It's been a wonderful experience to have connected with you. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Rachel. And it's such a privilege, to be heard and listened to for so long and so thoughtfully, and to contribute energetically as well. So, it's it's a really extraordinary thing just to do what you're doing right now. And so, I mean, I don't take that for granted at all. It helps me shape thoughts. It helps me say things I didn't know I believed. All those things are huge and important. And I look forward to being able to teach. And for those people that might be interested in learning things from me, one of the things I'd like to teach that I think we mentioned was, I love this question of like, what makes art good? Because it's kind of an endless problem we'll never have an answer for. I don't think it gets asked out loud enough. And I kind of am excited to kind of use making something very specific. Like I really want to teach a technique. Maybe it's just this one with the graphite stick on this piece of paper and it gets all flowy. But I would love to look at the problem of like what makes art good within some kind of exercise like that. Because you're never not living your life, and art can help you kind of learn about it. And learning what makes art good is usually saying more about how you perceive your life than anything else. So that's a pretty exciting like way in. And I look forward to being able to teach that through your platform.
Yeah, I can't wait. I think it's going to be a whole other angle. I see a beautiful partnership.
Yeah, me too. I feel very lucky to have had you come across my path here.
For once, I'm very grateful to Instagram. That's all I'll say. There are so many bad things about it, but this has been a great thing.
The first. Yeah.
Well,
you never know.
Well, you were saying what makes art good. I'll say what makes a podcast good. Having Tim as a guest. So there you go.
Ah, that's very sweet. Thank you. Appreciate all the time.
You're welcome. Oh, lovely listener, just before you go and press the off button, can I ask you to do me a favour, please? If you've really enjoyed this interview, imagine another version of you out there who doesn't know about this interview, who doesn't know about this podcast, and yet you'd really like to listen to it. Well, the way that you might find it if you didn't know about it was by those magic algorithms. And how do the algorithms pick up content? By reviews and star ratings. So if you wouldn't mind, could you please drop me some stars below or a review on this episode or any of the episodes of Breaking the Blocks? You can do this wherever you're listening on your podcast or, of course, in the comments on YouTube. Also, tell your friends, spread the word. Let's try and get some positivity out there and help other people to break their blocks.